Hello and welcome to this video. In this video, we will be covering 3 PC support benchmarks. How I covered these benchmarks is I 3D modeled an old motherboard I just had laying around. And this doesn't have some ports like a SATA port, but it does have some other things like a floppy disk connector. Now let's get started. The first part of the motherboard, or the first thing on the motherboard you should know about, is the CPU, which is currently under this giant heatsink. The reason why the heatsink is there is because the CPU generates so much thermal heat and needs that. Now if I make it invisible, you can see it's right there. Now let me just make the heatsink visible again. Okay, the next thing you should know about is the RAM. RAM stands for Random Access Memory. It's what the CPU uses to store data short term. There are different kinds of RAM. The kind of RAM that's on that motherboard is DIMM, which stands for Dual Inline Memory Module. Other types of RAM include SOBIMM, which stands for Small Outline Memory Module, and it's used in laptops. RAM, which is RAM Bus Memory Module, and SIMM, which is Single Inline Memory Module. Different generations of DIMM RAM include the original, which is just DIMM, the DRAM, the SDRAM, DDR, DDR2, DDR3, and DDR4. This is DDR2 RAM. As the RAMs go up in the generations, they get faster and increase in memory storage. And that's all I have for RAM. Now let's move on. The next thing you should know about is the South Bridge. The bridges. There is a North Bridge and a South Bridge. The North Bridge being right there, and the South Bridge being right there. The North Bridge is what connects the CPU and the RAM to the rest of the computer. And the South Bridge connects everything else to the North Bridge, which connects it to the CPU. So these two bridges are the gateway to the CPU and the RAM. The next thing you should know is the 20+4 pin connector. This is what the PSU attaches to the motherboard in order to power the motherboard. In addition to the 20+4 pin, we also have two IDE ports, which are right down there. IDE ports are the old version of SATA, and they are much slower than SATA, and they are much larger than SATA. Now, one thing about IDE ports is they have a missing pin right there, so you can't plug them in upside down, and also the cables used to connect IDE are a giant ribbon. Now, after the IDE, we have a floppy disk connector, which is right there. These have become obsolete, so motherboard manufacturers are no longer putting them on their boards. Now the next thing you should know is the BIOS chip, which is right down there. It is where the BIOS are stored. Following that, we have the CMOS battery, which powers the onboard clock when the computer is turned off, and then we have the front panel connector, which connects the motherboard to the ports which are located in the front, such as USB, HDMI. Following that, we have our expansion slots. The purpose of an expansion slot is to add an additional capability, such as sound, enhanced graphics, or internet. The reason why there is nothing in these ports is because none of the slots in the motherboard I added had anything in them. Some examples of something you put in one of these is a GPU, a graphics card, or a SATA port. Now the front two are both PCI ports, but the smaller one, which is directly above the PCI, is known as PCI Express, which is right there. And then after that you have your AGP port, and which is right directly below the North Bridge. And that is about all I have for expansion slots. The last thing on the motherboard you should know about is the I/O panel, which is located to the left. It's right around there. These are the ports that are connected on the back of a desktop case. You can see here I have a PS2 port, which is used for keyboards and mice. Following that, I have a VGA and a parallel port, which are used to print documents and output video. Then we have 4 USB ports, followed by an RJ45, which connects it to the Ethernet, and last we have our audio ports. And that is all I have for these benchmarks. Thank you for watching.